My name is Taylor, and I'm 22 years old. I live in a small, quiet apartment on the outskirts of the city. It's close enough to the university to make commuting easy, but far enough away to offer the peace and solitude I've always craved. My place is modest, a few old pieces of furniture, a small desk stacked with books, and a bed that I clear off every evening after class. It's not much, but it's mine. I moved here 2 years ago, fueled by hope and ambition. Leaving behind my small hometown, a place where everyone knew each other and life felt like an endless loop, I was ready for something different. College was my chance to break free, to discover who I truly was, and to start building the life I wanted. The transition wasn't easy. The city felt unfamiliar and intimidating, and I didn't know anyone. Everything was outside my comfort zone. The classes were challenging, and I often felt like I wasn't the smartest person in the room. I wanted to make a good impression, but couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't quite fit in. Coming from a modest background, I sometimes wondered if that would always be a hurdle in a world where connections and wealth seemed to matter so much. Then I met Professor Jacob, and everything began to shift. Professor Jacob was 63 years old enough to be my father, maybe even older. He was the kind of man who commanded attention without saying a word. He had that rare quality that could make a person listen, really listen. He was a professor of literature, and his lectures weren't like the others. While other professors seemed like they were just going through the motions, Professor Jacob made every word feel like it carried weight. His lectures weren't just about literature. They were about life, about human nature, about the complexities of the world we live in. Every class was a story. I could never quite figure out how he did it. His voice was deep, smooth, and filled with emotion. Every lecture felt like a journey. There was a magnetism to him, something unspoken, something that drew me in. And the more I watched him, the more I became fascinated with him, not just his intellect, but the way he carried himself, his wisdom, the way his eyes sparkled when he spoke of the great works of literature. I admired him. And at first, it was just that, admiration. He was, in every sense of the word, a giant in his field. I started staying after class, wanting to ask him questions, wanting to prove that I was dedicated, that I was serious about my studies. But something shifted after a few weeks. It wasn't just academic admiration anymore. I began to feel something else, something more personal, more intimate. I wasn't sure how to process it, but I couldn't ignore it. Professor Jacob had become more than just my teacher. It wasn't until one day when I stayed late to ask him about an assignment that I realized how much I had changed. I had been struggling in my other courses, barely keeping up. But with his class, I was determined to do well. I wanted him to see that I was serious, that I wasn't just another student in the crowd. He had this effect on me. He made me want to be better. "Taylor, you're a bright student," he told me one day. His voice warm, his smile genuine. "You've got more potential than you give yourself credit for." His words were like a balm to my self-doubt. They made me feel like I could do anything, like maybe I wasn't just another forgettable face in the lecture hall. Maybe I had something to offer. But then when midterms rolled around, I realized that I had procrastinated. I had left everything until the last minute. I hadn't done the necessary reading. I hadn't put in the effort. My paper wasn't my best work, far from it. But still, I couldn't help but think that Professor Jacob might see something in me, something beyond my laziness, something worth rewarding. I had this crazy hope that maybe, just maybe, he would give me a break. When the grades came back, I was shocked. A perfect grade for a paper that didn't deserve it. I knew I hadn't earned it, but I also knew that somehow, in some way, I had. It was as if he had seen past the mistakes. Seen me for what I could be instead of what I had been. I couldn't contain the feeling that washed over me. Gratitude, confusion, and something else that I couldn't name. I felt like I owed him something, like he had done me a favor, and I couldn't leave it at that. I needed to thank him. The next day, I went to his office after class. I knocked on the door softly, not sure what to expect. When he looked up from his papers, I felt a flutter in my chest. "Thank you, Professor," I said, my voice shaky. "Thank you for the grade. I didn't deserve it, but I really appreciate it." He smiled, the same warm, kind smile that made me feel like I was the only person in the room. "You deserved it, Taylor," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "I see something in you. You just need to believe in yourself." Those words, simple as they were, stuck with me. He believed in me. And for the first time in a long time, I believed in myself too. It wasn't just the grade. It was the fact that someone like him saw something in me, something that made me feel like I could be more than I had ever thought possible. That's when the idea began to form in my mind. Maybe there was more to this than just grades. Maybe I could get something more from him. He had been kind to me. He had praised me, and I couldn't ignore the growing feelings I had for him. I didn't want to admit it, but I was becoming obsessed. A few weeks later, I stayed after class again. But this time, it wasn't about assignments. It wasn't about my grades. It was about something more, something that made my heart race. I was struggling financially, and I didn't know how I was going to make it through the semester. I needed a way to secure my future. I needed help. "I need your help, Professor," I said, my voice trembling. Though I tried to sound confident, I'm not doing well in some of my other courses. I really need to improve my grades if I want to stay in school. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, but I could feel the weight of his gaze. "What exactly are you asking, Taylor?" he asked, his voice calm. But there was an undertone of something I couldn't quite identify. My heart pounded in my chest. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a whisper. "I'll do anything you want. Just make sure I pass." There was a long silence between us, thick and heavy. I could feel the tension building, and I regretted my words the moment they left my mouth. What was I asking for? Was I really prepared to go this far? Finally, he moved toward me, his expression softening just slightly. But his eyes were sharp, focused. "You understand the consequences of this, don't you?" he asked, his voice low and serious. I nodded, though in truth, I wasn't sure if I understood. I didn't care. I needed this. I needed him. That night, we crossed a line. It wasn't love, not at first. It was transactional. I gave him what he wanted, and he gave me what I needed. And at first, it felt like a relief, a way to secure my future, a way to guarantee that I wouldn't have to worry about my grades anymore. But after, when it was over, there was a rush of satisfaction, followed by a deep wave of guilt. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. It was supposed to be simple, just a way to ensure I could stay in school. But somewhere along the way, it became more than that. The more I saw him, the more I wanted him. The physical connection was undeniable. But there was something else, something deeper that I couldn't explain. It wasn't just about grades anymore. It was about him. It was about us. I tried to keep telling myself that I was using him, that this was just a means to an end. But I couldn't lie to myself. I was falling for him, and I couldn't stop it. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was dangerous, but I couldn't help myself. Every time I was with him, it felt like I was drawn further into his orbit. After that first night, everything changed. The dynamic between Professor Jacob and me shifted. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just about getting ahead, just about securing my future. I told myself I wasn't in love with him. How could I be? He was my professor. He was old enough to be my father. It didn't make sense. But the more I saw him, the more I began to realize that my feelings were no longer just about grades or getting the validation I craved. They were about him, about the way he made me feel, the way he saw me. I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Those gray eyes that seemed to pierce through me, see the parts of me I kept hidden from the world. There were moments when I was with him, when he looked at me with a certain softness, that I thought maybe he felt the same way. Maybe he was falling for me too. And yet, in the back of my mind, I knew the truth. This was wrong. It was dangerous. It could destroy us both. But still, I couldn't pull away. The connection was too strong. We began to meet in secret, often late at night when the university was quiet and the halls empty. Our meetings were a mix of lectures, personal discussions, and fleeting touches. Each time, it felt like I was falling deeper into something I couldn't control. Professor Jacob would speak to me about his past, about the life he had lived before becoming a professor, his regrets, his ambitions. I listened, mesmerized by the depth of his knowledge, his wisdom, and his vulnerability. It felt intimate in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the physical connection. It was the emotional bond that was growing between us, a bond that I couldn't break, no matter how much I tried. The affair, though it had started as a means to secure my academic future, had now evolved into something far more complicated. Professor Jacob was no longer just my professor. He was someone I had come to rely on, someone I had begun to fall for. And I knew, deep down, that I wasn't the only one. There were moments when he would look at me with a tenderness that made my heart ache. It was in those moments that I let myself believe he cared for me, that I wasn't just a student to him, but someone he valued. But the guilt, the shame started to grow. I knew what we were doing was wrong, that we were both breaking so many unspoken rules. I had crossed a line, and every time we met, I felt the weight of it on my shoulders. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about the lies I had to tell myself, the lies I had to tell the world. No one knew what was really going on between us, and I had to keep it that way. The secrecy felt suffocating, but at the same time, it was the only thing that made the affair possible. I had told myself that it would stay simple, that it would just be about the grades, just about securing my future. But every time I saw Professor Jacob, it felt like the boundaries between us were becoming more blurred. I wasn't just doing this for my grades anymore. I was doing it for him. I was doing it because I wanted him. I couldn't deny it, no matter how much I tried. I had fallen for him, and I knew that it was dangerous. But it was too late to stop. Then one day, a few weeks after that first night, I received an unexpected invitation. Professor Jacob asked me to meet him in his office after hours. I didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't unusual for him to ask students to meet him one-on-one to discuss assignments or concerns. But as the time approached, I felt a knot form in my stomach. There was something in the air, something that felt different. I wasn't sure if I was ready for what was about to happen. When I arrived at his office, the door was slightly ajar. I knocked softly and entered. Professor Jacob was sitting at his desk, glasses perched on his nose, papers scattered across the surface. He didn't look up at first, and for a moment, I felt like I was intruding on his personal space, on his life. I hesitated, unsure of what to say, but then he looked up and the moment our eyes met, I felt a rush of emotions flood through me. The warmth that had once been in his gaze had faded, replaced with something I couldn't quite place. "Taylor," he said softly, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Sit down." I did, trying to steady my breath. Something about the way he spoke made my heart race. It wasn't the usual warmth I had come to expect from him. There was an edge to his voice, a quiet tension in the air that made everything feel heavier. "I wanted to talk to you about the direction we're heading," he said. His voice steady but filled with a depth I couldn't ignore. "What we're doing, Taylor, it can't continue." My heart skipped a beat. His words hit me like a slap in the face. It was as if the ground beneath me had been pulled away and I was left floating in a sea of confusion and uncertainty. "I've been thinking about this a lot," he continued. His eyes now focused on me, studying me as if trying to read my every thought. This affair, it's not fair to you and it's not fair to me. It can't go on any longer." The weight of his words crushed me. I wanted to argue, to tell him that I didn't care about fairness, that I just cared about him, about what we had. But the reality of the situation hit me hard. This was wrong. We both knew it, but that didn't make the feelings go away. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. I felt like I was drowning in the silence between us. But no, Professor, I don't want it to end, I finally managed to say, my voice trembling. I need you. I've fallen in love with you. The words spilled out before I could stop them. It was as if they had been building up inside me for weeks. And now that they were out, I couldn't take them back. For a moment, Professor Jacob just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he shook his head. Taylor, he said, his voice firm but tinged with sadness. You're not in love with me. You're in love with the idea of me. I'm your professor. This was always a mistake. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that I didn't care about the age gap, about the complications, that all I cared about was him. But deep down, I knew he was right. This wasn't love. It couldn't be. We were two people caught in a situation we couldn't escape from. Two people who had crossed a line we shouldn't have. This has to end, Taylor, he said, his voice filled with regret. I'm sorry, but it's over. I stood there, frozen, my heart shattering into 1,000 pieces. The man I had trusted, the man I had fallen for, was walking away. I had given him everything, my trust, my love, my body. And he was leaving me behind. The days that followed were a blur. I kept going to class, doing my best to act normal, even though everything felt off. The warmth that had once been in Professor Jacob's eyes was gone, replaced by something distant, something cold. I tried to avoid him, but it seemed impossible. Every time I saw him, my heart tightened. I couldn't look at him without feeling a deep, painful longing. One day, after class, he stopped me in the hallway. His face looked weary, drawn, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at me with those stormy eyes, as if wrestling with words he couldn't quite bring himself to say. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with emotion. I want you to know, he began, that I never meant to hurt you. But I'm not who you think I am. I can't be what you need, not in the way you want me to be. I stood there, his words sinking deep into my chest. Part of me wanted to scream, to tell him I didn't care about anything else, that I just wanted to be with him. But I knew better. This wasn't something that could be fixed. Goodbye, Taylor, he said softly, before turning and walking away. I watched as he disappeared down the hallway, my feet rooted to the spot. The air felt heavy, weighed down by the finality of it all. I knew this was the end, the affair, the feelings, the illusion. It was all over.